Welcome, everyone. As you're coming in, just get settled. Maybe pour that third glass of coffee, whatever you need for this afternoon. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes. So just hang on and we'll be with you just in a moment. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started today. Hi, everyone. It's good to see a lot of familiar names in our attendee list. Good to see you again. My name is Michael Ibrahim, and I am Program Manager within the Cultural Investment Portfolio here at the Mass Cultural Council. The CIP's focus is grants and services for nonprofit cultural organizations, and we're super excited to present our first session in a series with the Nonprofit Finance Fund on financial leadership for boards. This workshop is part of our Recover, Rebuild, and Renew efforts to help organizations come back from COVID-19. This spring, we're offering 2 free workshops every Tuesday and Thursday per week in the areas of financial management, legal issues, human resources, advocacy, management, and board governance. And I'm sure that's not a surprise for some of you who've been coming back for more workshops, so it's great to see you. Joining us today are Michael Cass and Christine Alvarez from the Nonprofit Finance Fund. As I mentioned, we are launching today a series of 12 webinars with the folks from the Nonprofit Finance Fund. So we're excited to kick that off today, every Tuesday now between now and June, middle of June, actually. So while we get started in just a moment, I've got some few ground rules for you. If you want to rename yourself with your organization and pronouns, that would be wonderful. You can say hi to everybody in the chat. We have automatic captioning for today. Automatic generated captions are provided on all Mass Cultural Council Zoom meetings and webinars. If you'd like additional accommodations to ensure your participation for future webinars, please let us know and we'll happy to provide that. If this is distracting for you, you can actually hide those subtitles by clicking hide subtitles in your closed captioning settings. That's at the bottom of Zoom. We will have time for questions throughout this session. Michael is facilitating that today, so we ask that you please use the Q&A function in Zoom and not the chat. That way you can keep Michael organized with the questions. This session is being recorded and it will be available on our website on YouTube within a few days. You'll get an email from me when that is ready. Almost final, my colleague Sarah Glidden is here and she will be providing some resources in the chat box as we go along. She's already started. This session does run for an hour, and that includes the time for the questions. And with that, I'd love to turn it over to Michael and Christine. I think you're on mute, Michael.
I'm actually much more interesting when I'm on mute. Hi, everybody. And thank you. I'm Michael Cass. I'm here representing Nonprofit Finance Fund. I'm a consultant with the organization, and it's a privilege to be here with you all today to kick off our series on nonprofit financial management. We're going to be with you for 12 weeks. So get excited. I know nonprofit finance is everybody's favorite topic. Before we jump in to our content, what I'd like to do is offer a land acknowledgement. One of the things that we're really dedicated to at Nonprofit Finance Fund is being part of building a more just and equitable world. And part of that is really acknowledging the history of the land that we're on. Over the past year, this has become really important, not just because of the social and political upheaval in the pandemic, but because we've been meeting so much in virtual spaces, which are by definition not on land, right? They exist in the ether. And so in doing this land acknowledgement, it's a way of rooting ourselves back into the land that we're on and back into the larger story that we're a part of. So as I facilitate this today, I'm doing it from land that was stolen from the Apache and Pueblo peoples. Today it's known as Santa Fe, New Mexico. And as I acknowledge that, I'm very aware that the conversation we're having about nonprofit finance and nonprofit management doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a much larger history of this country and of the land that we're on. So before we jump in, I'll just invite us to pause for a moment and take a moment to acknowledge the history of the land that you're on and its ancestral peoples. If you don't know the identity of those peoples, there's a link in the PowerPoint, native-land.ca. And just we'll create a little bit of space for that before we begin. And maybe let's just take a nice long breath together as we get ready to learn. So breathing in and release. I'm guessing that about a quarter of you actually just did that breath, and that's great. All right, so let's get started. I want to introduce both myself and I'm joined today by Christine Alvarez from NFF, and we have two more colleagues that we'll introduce. So I'm a consultant with Nonprofit Finance Fund. I've been involved with the organization in one form or another since 2010. And before that, I spent years in the nonprofit sector, mostly in arts and culture organizations as a fundraiser, as an executive leader, and even as a board member. So I'm really excited to bring all of that experience to our work together today. And I'm really excited to be joined by Christine.
Yes, hi, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Right now, my name is Christine Alvarez. I'm a director for a nonprofit finance fund in their advisory services practice, and I've been with the organization since 2005. And so bring, sort of like the just like the breadth of knowledge, on the ground, from a variety of organization sectors, at different points of their evolution and size, into this conversation. Looking forward to working with you all over the next 12 weeks. So thank you.
And over the next 6 weeks, we'll also be joined by our colleagues, Robert Kagan and Marissa Kubasek. And you'll be meeting them, I believe, in weeks 4 and 5 as we move through the first half of our time together. If you're not familiar with Nonprofit Finance Fund, this is a little bit about us as an organization. What's not on here is that we were founded in 1980 with a very narrow focus. Clara Miller was the founder, and she started the organization to help nonprofit organizations get financing specifically for energy costs. That was it. But what happened over time is that organizations, and especially arts and culture organizations, wanted more. They went, oh, well, can we get financing for this other thing? And then once they got that financing, they would ask for, well, now we've got the financing, how do we manage it responsibly? And so over the past 40 years, the organization has really grown to encompass a wide suite of services. We still provide financing for organizations. And now we also provide consulting services, partnership, and knowledge sharing, which is part of this initiative that we're all part of together. And we do all of this guided by the core values that you can see on the screen, right? Equity in action. We lead by doing. And you'll notice that throughout our webinar series together, what we've tried to do is organize it in such a way that we present information and then give you a chance to do something with it, to digest it, because we know that this information can be a little bit dense for some people. So we're really dedicated to taking it slow and making sure that you have the chance to put some of this knowledge that we're sharing into practice. So that's a little bit about us. We'd love to know a little bit about who's in the room and give you a chance to know that as well. So Michael, if you'd be okay sharing that poll, just so we can get a sense of who is in the room. So the poll question is simply, what roles do you hold in the organization that you're here representing today? You a board member, executive director, CFO, other staff? Take a moment to answer that poll. And what's interesting about today's topic is that even though it's financial management for board members, really this relates to everybody in the organization, because at some level we're all involved in working with board members and helping our board members become stronger stewards of our organization. And if we're a board member, in being stronger stewards of the organization. So whenever we have some results, we'll just close the poll. Mostly board members, 68% board members. Fantastic. Welcome, 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 welcome. So as we get into our conversation today, there's one thing that we want to establish right at the outset. There is a wealth and a great range of different familiarity and comfort around nonprofit finance with board members all over the country, right? Some board members are really, really comfortable with it. I will candidly share that when I first became a board member for an organization, I did not know anything about nonprofit finance. This was in like 2002, nor did I know that as a board member, I was responsible for that, right? So that's one end of the spectrum. And on the other end of the spectrum, you may be a board member who's very involved in finance and are here maybe just looking for new tools or structures to help you facilitate really powerful conversations with your organization and achieve greater clarity. Wherever we are on that spectrum, our hope is that you'll participate freely and openly in the webinar, asking questions and sharing your knowledge with each other through the chat. We'd also like to invite you, at this point in remote work, please take care of your needs first. This is being recorded, so if you need to get up and take a walk, if you need to get up and get a snack, please feel free to do so. No one can see you, so it's all good. Here are our goals for the day. We're really going to look at the roles and responsibilities of board members. We're going to explore different nonprofit business models and capital structures, how we can really gauge the health of our organizations. We want to provide some frameworks and tools that are really concrete to help you as board members and also as executive leaders and other staff really help with governance and oversight of your organization's financial and organizational health. And we want to hopefully create a space as much as is possible in this format to share our expertise with one another, to provide support in a peer learning environment. Again, the times that we're in are really, really unique. There is no expert anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world on navigating the pandemic and navigating the reentry that we're going to be starting to experience. That said, there is a lot of experience and wisdom in these rooms, even if the rooms are virtual. And so if Christine or I can't answer a question, we have no doubt that somebody in this session can. When we talk about nonprofit finance, it's really important to understand that the financial considerations of an organization are intertwined and deeply interrelated with the mission, values, and vision. That seems really obvious, but over and over again in organizations all over the country, what we've seen often is that the finances get siloed off. There's the mission and the programs, and there's everything that we're really passionate about. And then, okay, we have to deal with the finances, right? What we'd like to propose is bringing everything back into alignment. So when we're having financial conversations, we're actually having mission conversations. We're still having conversations about our values, right? If we look at an organization's budget or balance sheet, we can tell what they as an organization prioritize, right? So these conversations are not about accounting. These conversations are not really about the mechanics necessarily of how we track funds, although we do cover that. These conversations are about how we integrate nonprofit finance and these conversations into these larger considerations about the overall health of our organization and our mission. So there are 3 financial responsibilities that we as nonprofit board members and trustees have. These are called the 3 duties. Whenever I go over these, I sometimes think, oh, it sounds a little bit like Game of Thrones. And it does. So we can make it fun. The first is the duty of obedience. simply making sure that our organizations are staying true to all the applicable laws and acts, that we're acting in an ethical way, that we're adhering to a nonprofit's stated purposes, and that everything we do in some way advances our mission, right? In future sessions, we'll talk about the fact that sometimes we take on activities or programs that might not be exactly aligned with our mission, but we're doing it because they subsidize or fund activities that are really aligned with the mission, but might not be able to bring in as much money, right? So sometimes these conversations are not as clear cut as, does this advance our mission or does it not? The second duty is the duty of loyalty, making decisions in the best interest of the nonprofit. Again, this seems like it would go without saying, and yet we've seen several times, I'm thinking of two specific instances now, where board members acted in their own self-interest, and they weren't even necessarily aware that they were doing it and not in the interest of the nonprofit. So always keeping the mission and the organization front and center. And finally, the duty of due care, which is where a lot of our conversation today is going to focus. How do we prudently use all of our assets, not just our funds, not just our money, but our facilities, our people, our goodwill, our relationships in the community? How do we do that in a way that is responsible and ethical and advances our mission? And we provide oversight for all activities. There's a difference, right, between oversight and implementation that we'll be talking about. A lot of times as board members, we may be tempted to get in the weeds with our organization, especially when it comes to budgeting. And that's where that distinction between implementation and oversight comes in. As board members, we're really responsible for holding often a larger view of the organization. Unless, for example, we're on the finance committee or the budgeting committee, then we may get a little bit more granular. So let's look at what that duty of care, duty of due care might look like, the specific financial oversight responsibilities of the board. The first are concrete tasks. These are concrete things you can put on a to-do list and then cross off, right? We oversee the annual budgeting process and we monitor progress, right? What is our budget versus actual? What's our performance looking like? Then, based on that, we can make our decisions based on accurate financial data and in light of mission goals. I want to pause there for a moment to highlight the fact that sometimes what seems to be an obvious financial decision might not be the right decision for the organization's mission, right? In a later webinar, we'll be talking about how to balance our money and our mission. But for now, it might be enough to simply say that sometimes in order to preserve the mission and make sure that we're still providing our core services to the community, we might have to make a decision that doesn't seem like the best financial decision. And at the same time, we might have to make a really hard financial decision that's the best financial decision in order to preserve the long-term viability of our mission. So again, there's some nuance to these conversations that we have. And finally, ensuring adequate oversight of the audit relationship. Some of you may not have to do audits. Your organizations may have a small enough budget, but if you do, then the board is responsible for making sure that that goes smoothly. If you don't, you probably have an annual report, and as a board member, part of your responsibility is ensuring adequate oversight of that as well. So those are the concrete tasks. Those are the things that we can cross off of a to-do list. Things that are a little bit more nebulous that we'll be exploring today are processes and support, right? More broadly, as board members, how can we ensure adequate financial resources so that our organizations can implement their programs, can fulfill their missions? How can we prepare our organizations for risk, right? One of the things that happened over the past year is there is no way that any of our organizations could have been prepared for the past year, right? Now that our imaginations in a way have been expanded around the possible scenarios, right? The constant reopenings and the closings, who knows what could happen. Now, as board members, maybe there's a different conversation that can be had about risk and how do we build reserves to ensure the long-term viability of our mission in really unprecedented times. As board members, we can also help take the long-term as opposed to the short-term view. Again, in situations like we've seen over the past year, the temptation can be to get tunnel vision, right? To be in this constant crisis response mode. One of the things that we can do that's a huge gift to the organizations that we're serving as board members is to take a deep breath and to take a longer term view, right? One of the conversations that I've had with many board members over the past year is around the long-term impact of their organization's missions. Chances are that your mission predates COVID and won't be accomplished by the end of the pandemic, right? And so our mission is larger and deeper than the immediate crisis. And sometimes as board members, providing that perspective can be a huge service to our organizations. And finally, protecting the assets of the organization. And again, the assets are not just the money, not just cash. The assets are our people, our equipment, our facility, our relationships. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. So that's a context for what we're going to be really exploring in more detail for the next 30 minutes or so. Now we're going to spend most of our time on the do's of board financial management, and then we'll sort of glance at the don'ts. But our hope is that by really going through everything that can help us be effective board members, it will mitigate against some of the risks and some of those don'ts that we have over on the right side of the screen. And again, as we go through this, please feel free to put questions into the Q&A box. There's no such thing as a bad question. And chances are that if you're holding a question, somebody else on the webinar is as well. So our first do, building on what we were just talking about, is thinking big picture. Always tying our decisions back to the mission and to organizational health. And to help with that, at NFF, we develop what we call a strengths-based framework. We also call it the complete capital model. And here's what this looks like, right? As we've said before, our capital is not just money. It's also our data and our know-how, right? What do we know that nobody else knows? What expertise do we bring to the table that actually is a form of capital for our organization? Who are our people? What skills do they have? What skills do we have as an organization? An example for the past year is organizations and people in those organizations who were really well acquainted with building out online programming, particularly for arts organizations, suddenly found themselves in incredible demand, right? So what are the skills that we have that we might be taking for granted? Whether it's community building skills, whether it's technical skills. Our financial resources, absolutely important. How are we covering our costs? How are we investing in our people? How are we investing in the future? And then our networks and relationships. How long have we been active in our communities? What relationships do we have either with funding entities? What relationships do we have with each other? How might we be able to collaborate to help each other as we navigate these unprecedented times? And these four together create what we would consider a picture of complete capital. So Sarah just put into the chat a link to a worksheet version of this slide, and we're going to spend a moment on it. You'll see that we have those four areas of capital down the left side: financial, networking, relationships, people and skills, data and know-how. Along the top, you have our strengths in those areas, our needs, and our opportunities and risks. What we've seen as a general trend across all organizations throughout time is that as board members and as staff, we tend to go straight to our needs and our opportunities and risks. And as a result, we miss and we take for granted the strengths that we have in these four areas. It is much easier to build, manage, and supervise from a place that is grounded in the strengths of our organizations than it is to manage from the deficits to be constantly in fix-it mode. So I'm going to pause here for, let's take 2 minutes. It's 25 after the hour now. And we're just going to be here in silence for 2 minutes. It's very rare over Zoom. Take a moment, take those 2 minutes to either fill out or simply think about the strengths that your organization has in each of these 4 areas. And something that can happen sometimes is we're so unused to thinking about the strengths of our organization that nothing immediately comes to you. And that's fine as well. That's really good information to have. So I'm curious if you had a chance to think about some of the strengths of your organization, maybe just pop into the chat, and if you're comfortable doing so, share one of your organization's strengths in the chat. This will help us get a broad picture of strength from which to build the rest of our conversation today. Yeah. So this tool is something that you now have to share with your organization. So if you're a board member, you can bring it to your executive director and say, hey, we think this would be a great way to structure a conversation. Lee, thank you for sharing that. A hands-on, highly engaged, committed board. We have experienced artistic leadership, 15 plus years, networking, numerous sustained partnerships. We're well respected, right? All of these are really powerful strengths that we can build on when it comes to address some of those needs, risks, and opportunities, instead of trying to build from the place of deficit or fixing. So once we have a sense of that big picture, we can get a little bit more granular, and learning the business. Elizabeth, I think you timed that perfectly, sharing that that they're a concert presenting organization and half the board has been in the trenches as performers themselves. When our board members have been performers, when our board members have been involved with our organization in other ways, they often have a really good sense of what our business model is, right? About how revenue and expenses work in the context of our organization. And that's the next part of our dues when it comes to strong board financial management. And this is in 2 pieces. The first is learning our business model. How are we covering our costs, right? Are we generating surpluses, and can those surpluses contribute to investing in the future of our organization? Are we putting savings away? Are we building reserves? How's money coming into the organization? Are we all ticket-based? How much of our revenue comes from grants? How much might come from individuals? And how has that shifted over the past year or the past 5 years? At the same time, looking at how money flows out from our organization. How do we spend our money? Do we have predictable expenses, right? How are we able to course correct or shapeshift in response to ongoing and evolving realities? Let's put it that way. Once we've looked at the business model, we can also look at our capital structure, right? The capital structure is sort of the foundation upon which the business model grows. How healthy is our balance sheet? And that simply means how much do we own versus how much we owe? How much of our fixed assets are we investing in? How are we managing our debt? We'll go in future webinars into a lot more detail about the difference between strategically managed debt, which is debt that we take on because we know that money's going to be coming in, we just don't have it yet. So we may take out a line of credit to plug the gap, and living off of credit or living off of debt, which is less strategic. And we often see organizations getting into trouble when they use debt in that way. And then our liquidity. How much cash do we have? Can we cover our current obligations? Can we cover payroll? Can we cover our vendor payments, right? How much of our cash is restricted? And how much do we have available for operating support, right? This is something that's utterly unique to our organizations as nonprofits. Oftentimes, if a board member from the for-profit business world joins a nonprofit, this idea that a contributor could give you money and tell you how to spend it seems insane. What we've seen a lot over the past year during COVID, and you may have experience with this, is many organizations approaching funders who have offered them restricted gifts and asking for the ability to unrestrict those gifts so that they have more flexibility in responding to the situation as it unfolds. One of the things that we really want to make clear, and you'll hear it over and over again throughout these webinars, is organizations, and we'll get into a little more in a moment, our nonprofit organizations can generate surpluses. We can make money as nonprofit organizations, right? One of the things we get a lot of from board members specifically is when it comes time to budgeting, well, we have to break even. We can't make money, we're a nonprofit. And we'll talk about how that misunderstanding came to be in a moment. But for now, this is a really powerful way of looking at the business structure and flow of our organization, right? We start looking at our balance sheet. A balance sheet is a snapshot in time of the financial situation of our organization. It lets us know how much we own and how much we owe. Do we have access to enough cash in order to invest into our business model? Our business model meaning all the ways that we make money to support our incredible programs that advance our mission, right? When we reinvest those assets into our business model, it enables us to cover our costs. And ideally, what our business model does is it generates not a zero level budget, it generates surpluses, because those surpluses build our balance sheet. And so we can ideally get a really stable cycle going in our operations. When it comes time to grow or shift, we may get a one-time infusion of cash, growth capital, something that comes in once to help us with a new production, to help us with a new program, or to help us shift our business model. That then moves into this business cycle, right? I'm sort of thinking about how to put this next part. I will candidly say that there are very few organizations that generate consistent surpluses, especially over the past year. So as we move into this conversation, especially as board members, the idea isn't that we flip a switch and all of a sudden we're able to do this. The idea is to maybe create a different frame for these conversations around the financial health of our organization so that over time we can shift the direction and start to build these surpluses and reserves. As we do that, to help really frame those conversations, one of the concepts that we talk a lot about at NFF is the idea of full cost. And let's go into that a little bit. What is full cost? How do we plan for the long-term needs and viability of our organization and our mission? The first thing to say, it's sort of a mantra that we say at NFF, nonprofit is a tax status. It's not a business model. The technical term is actually not for profit. And that simply means that our organization's surpluses don't go to shareholders. That's it. You can make as much profit as you want as a nonprofit organization or a not-for-profit organization. There's actually, and this is one of the most wonderful ways I found of dealing with this issue and this misunderstanding. There's a program in Fresno called the Humanics Program, which is training the next generation of not-for-profit organization leaders. And they actually don't allow their students to use the term nonprofit at all. They use community benefit organization, right? And the reason they do that is because this misunderstanding has become so endemic that it actually finds its way into our budgeting processes. And it's even found its way into funder practices that always ask for zeroed out budgets. So when we start talking about full cost, it can help get us away from that misconception and into a more realistic conversation around what it takes to run our organization. So our full costs aren't just our day-to-day expenses. They do include our operating expenses, but also includes investments in fixed assets. Fixed assets are things like your roof, your HVAC units, right? The computers, things that degrade in value over time and need maintenance. We always want to be budgeting for those. We want to be budgeting to pay off our debt principal, not just the interest, right? And we want to be building savings towards building working capital and reserves. One element that is not included here is sweat equity, right? In the not-for-profit sector, our people generally are chronically underpaid, right? We're putting in tons of extra hours to keep the organization going. Those are unfunded expenses. Just because we've all agreed to it doesn't mean that they're not unfunded. So one of the things that we can do as board members is start to really hold that frame when it comes to conversations, not to yell and scream that we've been doing everything wrong, but simply to invite a consideration of what might be possible if we were to think about, in the long term, funding the full costs of doing business. When we think of full costs, there's really 6 aspects to it that we'll look at. The first 3, and these are really must-haves for all of our organizations, are our expenses, our operating, our non-operating expenses, the unfunded expenses like sweat equity that I just talked about. We need working capital. We need cash just to get through our day-to-day needs. And really all organizations, even though we might not have as much of it as we'd like right now, all of our organizations need reserves, because with reserves comes adaptability. With reserves come the ability to not just adapt, but to invest in the future. Now, some organizations sometimes need these last 3. Some of our organizations have a debt principal repayment. Maybe you have a mortgage, maybe you have a line of credit. Some of our organizations need fixed assets. We need to purchase a new building, especially over the past year. Maybe we needed to purchase computers or tablets for our staff so that they could work remotely and be able to stay in. And we may need change capital. Those are those one-time capital infusions that allow us to adapt, grow, or expand. I'm seeing that Stephen put a question into the chat, and I'll read it out loud for everyone. Do you have information regarding replacement reserves? We've used a 3 to 5% annual reserve budget for capital replacement, which approximates the composite useful life. I'm going to defer, Christine, if you're there, do you have any information about what would be a good reserve budget for capital replacement? That looks right to me, but I know that you may have a better idea on that.
No, and thank you for the question, Stephen. And I think you probably won't be surprised to hear me say it really depends. Sometimes I think like another proxy could be the accounting proxy, of useful life, or wear and tear of those fixed assets. So depreciation, maybe one additional place we would ask you to consider, but but a more precise, estimate would certainly be, if you had the benefit of an engineering report, which I know, not many folks do have on hand, but just a couple of things to consider, just there is the accounting proxy of depreciation. There's also, if you had the benefit of just like an engineering, kind of like system replacement, kind of estimate, but the 3 to 5, also is not a bad place to start as well. So that's what I got.
Yeah. To build on what you just said, Christine, I think the answer to some of these specific financial questions is often it depends, which is the most frustrating answer we know that you could possibly get. But the fact is that our individual situations are different. And so, what I would say is if 3 to 5% seems to be working for you for capital replacement, that's perfect. Yeah. Fantastic. I hope that helps. So one of the things, and again, just going to how we can have better conversations as board members and with staff. This idea of full cost and even this chart can be really, really powerful in helping guide conversations. Because a lot of times, I've worked with so many board members who want to be useful, but they don't necessarily have the background in nonprofit finance or the comfort with these topics that would allow them to do that in a way that is useful. And so again, our hope is that some of these frameworks will be able to help you have more productive, more responsible conversations with your board, and if you're a board member, with the staff of the organizations you represent. So once we've figured out our capital structure, once we know where that money is coming from, where it's going, once we have an understanding of our full costs, right? What is in reality, what does it cost to run our organizations? Our next responsibility as board members is to monitor the progress and the health of the organization on an ongoing basis. So let's look at some tools that we can use to facilitate that. So as we discussed, the board is responsible for approving the budget, for the audit, for overseeing the 990. The last thing we want to do or have happen as board members is not be engaged in the financial realities of the organization. And the end of the year comes and it's time to review everything. And then suddenly all this information comes in an avalanche, right? That's really overwhelming. So what we can do, both as board members, what we can ask for, and as staff, what we can give to our board members are regular ongoing documents and reports. One is a narrative that describes the financial status of the organization. And I go a little bit further to say that that narrative wants to tie the financial reality of the organization to the mission, the vision, and the values of the organization. I believe the last webinar that we'll have together is about financial storytelling. And that's really what we're talking about here. Not just here's how much we spent and here's how much we brought in, but what the significance of that is for our mission, for our community. We always want to provide year-to-date revenue and expenses. We want to compare our year-to-date to our budget, right? How close are we to what we predicted? We want to provide our full year budget. And we generally want to look at how we performed this year compared to how we performed in the previous year, right? What is the difference between those? And is that healthy? Was it unexpected? There's a lot of room for conversation that can be spurred by this data. We want to look at cash flow projections. I'm not sure if your organizations use them. We have a whole webinar devoted to cash flow projections and how to do them in a way that is useful. But the basic idea of a cash flow projection is simply to look on a cash basis of each month what is coming into the organization and how much cash is going out, right? It gives us a very specific look at what our cash reality is. And then we also want to look at our balance sheet, which is the overall financial picture of health of our organization. And again, we're talking about this at a really high level today. As we get into the series, we'll be going in much more detail into every single one of these tools so that if you have them already, you might be able to strengthen them. And if you don't have them, you'll have a template to work with going forward. Other documents that you might work with, a dashboard of key performance indicators and program metrics, right? I'm curious, actually, in the chat, is there anyone who works with a dashboard already, right? Something that lets us know, not just financially, but also program-wise, how we're doing as an organization. We also have templates for that can help you build out a dashboard so that you know where your attention is needed. As we were just saying, we want to have an aging schedule for our accounts receivable and accounts payable, right? How much is owed to us? How much do we owe, if that's applicable? And an investment summary, if we have any investments, how are they doing, right? How much of those investments do we have access to? And what are the conditions under which we might want to access them? So these are all tools that we can provide to the board. Now, in doing this, one of the keys to working with the board, and as board members, you may have experienced this, I certainly have, is when a executive director gives me a huge stack of papers with financial information, I get overwhelmed, right? As a board member, that's not what I need. So as an executive director, right, what I've done in the past and what we invite all of you to do if you're not already doing it already, is to really think about what the board needs. If you're a board member, let your executive director, let the staff know what you need in order to be effective in fulfilling your duties, right? What is the information that's right for our audience? We want our reports to be digestible. And again, we'll be going through this and introducing specific tools to help with this. We want to make sure the audience is engaged. Our audience in this case is probably our board members, right? So what's their level of comfort? If they're not on our finance committee, what do they need to know in order to be useful? What's the right level of detail that we can include? So my favorite nightmare story about this is in 2008, I was working with an organization that served young people experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles. And during the financial crisis, we were faced with the really terrible choice that we had to cut our budget by 50%. And we needed the board's help to do that. And so we went in and we gave them our budget, and they immediately, with all the best intentions, went exactly to the wrong place. They went to the smallest line items, and they asked questions like, why are we spending $150 on postage? Maybe we could cut that. And where we really needed them to look, unfortunately, was at personnel, was at those large line items. This was not their mistake. This was ours as a staff, because we had not given them the right information to facilitate the conversation that we needed them to have, right? And so in thinking about the reports, what's the right level of detail? And then we also want those reports to be consistent, making sure that we're giving them the same good information month over month. And so as a board member, one of the things you can do gently, if you haven't already, is to advocate for getting the information that you need and really helping the staff of your organizations be better stewards of your time and your goodwill and your effort, right? Board reports, as always, everything in our organizations is unique. But depending on who our board is, depending on what our capital and business structures are, these reports might look a little bit different, right, for each organization. And again, we'll be going into this in a lot more detail in the coming weeks. Finally, the last do is, how do we collaborate to address our issues, right? How do we make sure that our conversations around financial management in our organizations are productive and maybe even interesting, right? Again, so many times these conversations can become either really grueling or they can become rubber stamp conversations, right? So here are some tools that can help us collaborate to address issues in the financial world of our organization. You'll have these questions. You'll be able to download this deck, but something that I want to really point out here is the open-ended nature of these questions. What that means is, how can we live within our means is very different than, are we living within our means, right? When we ask, how are we living within our means, then the only possible answers are yes or no. Then the conversation's over. Okay, we're not. Now we need another question. But if we ask, how can we live within our means? That can invite us into a little bit more of a generative conversation, which is exactly where we want to head with this stuff, right? With our business model changes. Not are our financial results varied from year to year, but how have they varied from year to year? What can we expect for future years? right? So we can invite each other as board members and staff into this sense of collaboration, right? How can cash flow help us manage cash? So the invitation here is when you find yourself moving into those binary questions, are we doing well? For example, is one that I hear a lot. Um, See if you can find a more open-ended, inviting way to phrase it so that the conversation can be more creative and generative. Because then those conversations can actually be fun in the same way that our conversations about our mission and our impact really stoke our passion. We want to try to do the same thing for the financial life of our organizations. So those are all the do's. I just want to spend a couple of moments on the don'ts. We've covered most of these in an implicit way as we've gone through all the do's, all of the things that can help us really fulfill our duties as stewards of our organizations. We don't want to get in the weeds. We don't want to be talking about how much we're spending on postage, right? As much as possible, we want to move towards integrating finances into the conversations about mission and vision and values, right? We don't want to keep finances siloed off, and we don't want to keep our financial staff siloed off either. We want to include them in those generative conversations about the long-term viability of our mission. Please don't fear a surplus. A surplus is a beautiful, beautiful thing, right? If you want to adopt our mantra, nonprofit is a tax status, not a business model, that's great. Please share that far and wide. We don't want to rubber stamp financial conversations. We actually want to engage at the right level of oversight for budgets, right? With something that we see a lot, particularly with smaller organizations, is let's say there's an organization of $100,000, maybe $150,000. They just kind of look at the budget and go, okay, this is fine. Now let's talk about our mission. Let's talk about our programs. We'd urge you to slow down and take a breath and see if you can engage in that really generative and collaborative way in a conversation about the finances of our organization, our business model, what it looks like to build for the future. And then finally, we want to, as much as possible, avoid, I call it swooping. Here we call it surprising and derailing, right? As board members, and I've certainly been guilty of this, I won't get enough information to be active for a while, and then I'll get information and swoop in and want to change everything. I surprise and derail the work of the staff. As staff, what we can do to help the board not do that is make sure that we're giving them those consistent reports, make sure that we're having conversations on an ongoing basis, right? And as board members, we can ask for those reports so that we don't suddenly engage at the last minute and get into a situation where we are changing hard work that's been done at the staff without an ongoing conversation. So that is really what we wanted to cover today, right? And as we approach the end of the session, like Michael Ibrahim says in the chat, if there are any questions that you want to make sure we address in these last few minutes, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A. And where we're headed next, right? This session was really about how do we, as board members, engage with these financial conversations in our organizations, particularly because right now those might be hard, right? Over the past year, so many of our organizations have had to make really hard decisions. And so hopefully the information today will help enhance the great work that you're already doing. Where we're headed next in the series, the next two sessions are really about operating in a changing world. Christine will be facilitating part one of this, and this really talks about the underlying structure and framework of the not-for-profit world that we exist inside of, and how do we navigate it. And then in part two, we're going to look really specifically at what it means to operate in a world that is slowly and stumblingly emerging from the past year of the pandemic and social and political upheaval. So we really hope that you'll join us for those. And that's what we have for today. Thank you so much. We know that your time is valuable, and we're really glad that you took the time to be here today, and hope that this was useful. Hope that you can use some of these tools. So with that, I will hand it back over to Michael to close us out.
Well, thank you, Michael. And thank you again for being part of this. As we said, we really are looking at this 12-part series. You don't have to come to everything, whatever makes sense for you to register. We are having this uncharted navigation space in the next 2 weeks, but there may be some items in there that you want to share for other people or for board members or staff members. So feel free to share that to whomever, but you don't have to do them all at once. Yes, and the last thing I would just wrap up here, so we're respectful of your time, is just that you will get a recording of this in addition to the materials and links to register for the next sessions as soon as this recording has been downloaded and all that. So you'll get it, no problem. You can also find it on the YouTube channel that Sarah put out, Mass Cultural Council's YouTube channel, when that's available, because that is where we post it. But you'll get an email from me as well. I really want to say thank you to Michael and Christine for providing the great introduction to our work together with NFF for the next couple weeks. And we look to seeing the rest of you at the next session. Thank you, everyone, and have a great, safe rest of the day.